Good. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Session's been exciting,
It's wrapping up, which is good.
and you got the biggest thing through, right? The budget went through,
Yeah, glory be to
and
God.
the governor has signed it.
The governor has agreed to sign it. We expected her to sign it yesterday. I'm not sure whether she signed it overnight, but if she hasn't, she should be signing it today.
But it's essentially done.
It's passed out of both chambers. It was negotiated with obviously the governor's input, and she's agreed to sign it. So looks good.
Good. And what did you find interesting in the budget, or anything for the
It's a
particular
good
district?
budget. It's really it's a budget to be proud of. A number of salient points. For one thing, it's a reduction in spending, reducing the budget by 1.6%, which is really more than that, take into effect inflation and so on. So, and to put that in perspective, that's the first time that the budget has reduced ongoing spending since 2017. So that's a big victory, I think, for the state that we're being fiscally responsible. That's one. I don't want you all to think that we're slashing and burning because we're reducing the spending, though. Education spending is going up this year, 6.9%. So it'll be 2.9% in ongoing funding, forever going up 2.9 ongoing. And then in one-time funding for this year, additional 4%. So we're increasing the spending in education by 6.9%. They already waived the expenditure limit for schools, so you can spend that. And for transportation infrastructure is the second biggest thing. So the number one is education spending increases, but for transportation it's over 600 million. And you'll be glad to know that a little over 80 million of that is going to State Route 24. Which of course is important for Queen Creek, but also important for me as a Santa Ana Valley person, important really for the eastern half of the state. If you live in Gila County, you go to the airport you will go to the airport on State Route 24 when it's completed. So, and that's a big victory for our district too, because 80 million is more than 10% of that 600 plus million transportation infrastructure spending. So I think we've done pretty well. They're also funding, of course, other projects. State Route 30 in the West Valley has some funding. There's a significant amount going to Interstate 10, which obviously is very important.
The Interstate 10 project finishes the widening between Casa Grande and Eloy.
Widening on the Gila River Indian community. So just in terms of the budget, to recap, it does decrease spending, but increases spending to education, and I mentioned some of the transportation infrastructure, but also it's our belief, I say our, a number of us at the legislature, certainly your representatives and senators here, that the money you send us is money that you, the taxpayers, belongs to you, and you send it to the state in trust. So we're like a trustee spending it on worthy projects. And if there's too much money, there's really no such thing as too much money. We should spend the money we need to and give the rest back. So it's about 260 million, which we are giving back to the taxpayers in the form of a family tax credit. So for those who pay taxes, if you have a dependent child under 17 years of age, you'll receive $250, and I think the checks go out in November, I think, for children. If you have a dependent above 17, I think it's $100. And so we're giving some of the money back because...
So for quite a few months, actually better part of the last couple of years, revenues have been running ahead of projections each year. So you're saying that part of that is what's coming back to us.
I'm proud to say, one of the reasons I love being in Arizona, and we live in actually a very well managed state, very well run. One of the reasons it's well run is because the joint legislative budget people make predictions that are very conservative. So we almost never run the risk of over allocating what projected revenues are. So that's true. There's a number of reasons why we live in a great state. Another reason is that every single state agency sunsets. It means that it goes away by statute unless we reauthorize it. Now, I think the feds should do that. That would be wonderful. Because what it really means, so granted, we're not going to get rid of the Department of Corrections or something, but what it really means is that it gets audited every 8 years and that we have an opportunity to review what they're doing. So that's one feature, structural. It's such a great state. The other is the single subject rule. You know, we're forbidden from passing bills that address more than one thing. And the third thing that makes this a great state are the expenditure limits. So there's a lot of reasons why I think we're a good place structurally as a state.
I think Congressman Biggs introduced a bill at the federal level for the single line, single item bill, but probably not a lot of support at the federal level for that. But it would be nice. So you mentioned the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, JLBC, and they have been conservative over the last couple of years. Have you had discussions at the Capitol about next year's budget? Because it looks like from the JLBC at that point that surpluses pretty much go away.
So to be clear, when we do a budget, we do it 3 years out. So we look at this year and what we can allocate for this year, but there's also a column for next year and the third year. And they do the projection over 3 years and what the ongoing spending costs will be. Of course, we don't predict one-time spending costs. They're one time, right? If there's some money available, you make a one-time appropriation. But we do look at the window forward. Absolutely.
And so even with the reduction in revenues next year, should be okay.
Budget, we should be fine.
And so a lot of the one-time spending that came this year was because of those surpluses. So you put it into things like transportation.
About 300 million to education. Like I say, 600 million to transportation. The governor asked for 150 million to housing trust fund because of homelessness issues. So of course, requests address the priorities. And then, of course, like I said, about 260 million in the rebate and some other things.
And so one time, meaning that those things got funded, but there's no money for them next year, or they shouldn't require any money for next year.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked these things because what I've noticed is a lot of the citizenry is aware of. People say one time and ongoing, and they don't necessarily track with that because they don't. When we say ongoing, we're talking about the schools have a certain amount of money that goes to them via a formula, how many students and so on there are, and that is ongoing. Next year there will be students, and the year after, and so on. There are also, of course, full-time positions in the Department of Transportation, the state, and the Attorney General, and the courts, and all these things. If you it's obviously an ongoing expenditure because it's not go down again next year. So we look at ongoing, structurally balanced. Then if there's something that's left over afterwards, we can apply it to State Route 24. Why is State Route 24 not ongoing? Because once it's constructed, the construction's done. Obviously, there's maintenance of it and so on, but that would be considered a one-time fund.
And so structurally balanced is another important term. So we don't run deficits at the state level.
And that's the state level. It's another great reason to live in the state.
So if revenues suddenly drop and you have all of this ongoing spending, then you have to make cuts to one-time projects and ongoing.
Sure that it's balanced 3 years out. We make conservative budget estimates for revenue, and we've decreased the budget this year slightly.
And so then, as part of that, you mentioned the AEL, the expenditure limit for schools.
So there is an expenditure limit for everything. The county expenditure limit. So I just want to point that out. It's not the schools. The expenditure limit is in the state constitution. And the state constitution is imposed on all of us, the legislature included, by the people. And And the people put that provision there. People will have to change it if they want to change it. So it passed in, I believe, 1980, and the people imposed a spending cap on education. But as I say, there is a spending cap on basically on everything. So sometimes I hear people say, well, this is outdated. And I would disagree with that. If the Constitution is outdated, then the right to free exercise of religion is outdated. So is the right to speech and bear arms and all the other constitutional things. If the people decide to change it, it's fine. But I think that good fiscal management definitely. So the aggregate expenditure limit is a of the Constitution that says that the school a limit, it's imposed on that.
And so I would think that, though, what people argue is that the limit itself hasn't adjusted for inflation properly over those 45 years. So that's where we run into problems. So the same thing with what we went through recently with home rule with the town, that was so low that, well, is dollars. And so
the aggregate expenditure limit's adjusted for inflation and it's adjusted for student enrollment. But I'm glad you brought up education funding. I want to make a couple of points so the public knows. First of all, that education the last 2 years received $8 billion. Second, that is more than one your entire state. So it's a big priority for us. To be fair, it's about 47% or something. It's more than a half of universities. But we're spending more than half. If you take everything combined, courts and DPS, public safety and roads, education receives more than all of that combined in your state budget. And that's been the case for a long time. We waived the aggregate expenditure limit last year, this year, and they're waiving it for next year, which means we've hit the voter approved education spending. What that means is that we've been increasing spending on education every single year for over 10 years. So an article appeared in the Arizona Capital Times on March 2nd this year. You can look it up. Arizona Capital Times. It's written by Howard Fisher. And it reported that in-classroom spending has decreased last year. In-classroom spending has decreased even though school funding increased by $300 million. Now, we're here in the chamber. You're all business owners, so you know how things work. But what does that mean? Suppose that you're a restaurant and you have a certain amount of revenue. And one year, the amount that you spend inside your restaurant goes down. What that means is that the operations inside your restaurant are fully funded. You've got so much money coming into your restaurant that you decide to repave the parking lot because in-restaurant spending goes down. You don't need to spend more on your salaries in the restaurant or whatever. Well, it's the same for the schools. The funding has increased so much that for 3 years we're waiving the limit that they're getting more than $8 billion. It's more than half the state's funding. And their in-classroom spending has gone down, which means that they're choosing to spend the money on capital projects, on infrastructure, on groundskeeping, on other things, and not on teacher salaries and student-related projects. So that's a fact. That's in the Arizona Capital Times, March 2nd. I encourage you to look that up.
I think one of the important things to note, though, is that in Queen Creek, we're in hyper-growth mode. So we have to build those schools, and it is the state who is supposed to build the schools. So those capital expenditures specific to Queen Creek are because of growth issues. So, so you mentioned about 90 bills earlier that you guys still have to take a look at or deal with, even though the budget has gone through now. So the budget being the big thing.
The budget sucks the air out of the room.
Right.
A number of priorities for other members, not any of my bills.
And one of them is a bill that we've been talking about with membership quite a bit, and it's supposed to fix affordable housing and create affordable housing, but it does so by essentially allowing builders to build multifamily wherever they want. If it's zoned residential, they can just build an apartment building instead of finishing the subdivision, for example. Also taking away certain building requirements, right? So they don't have to necessarily meet whatever today's standards are. They can build the bare bones minimum and call it good. Is that bill still working its way through? How do you see that bill?
It's a package of 3 bills sponsored by Senator Kaiser. This is the second year he's been working on this. He held a series of statewide stakeholder meetings in all last year, and he came up with these ideas. One of them is to allow housing, low-income housing by right within a half a mile of a light rail. That wouldn't affect Queen Creek, but that was one of them. The other one, as you say, is a kind of zoning preemption bill. That's, for lack of a better way to put it, that's how I would put it, involving different things, lot sizes and things. There's also an element to it about approving applications in so much time and so on. All 3 of those bills came before the Commerce Committee. I'm on the Commerce Committee. I'm on Commerce, Transportation, and I'm the chairman of Ways and Means. And I voted against all 3. So, for the record, I voted against all 3 of those bills. So
We appreciate that.
The right person to ask it. My concern is twofold. Local control is almost and secondly, I'm afraid that if bills like this succeed, it amounts to turning the state legislature into the local planning and zoning commission, and that's not a good thing. Incidentally, there was a water bill that came up last week to deal with the situation that arose in Rio Verde. I voted against that too, for the same reason, because I'm afraid that in subsequent years we will be having a lot of people come to us. And I think it's probably not the best solution.
And that bill in particular would have required a municipality to provide the water to those outside of the municipality under certain circumstances.
Of it again, that there was a Cullinan version and a Gail Griffin version. One of them required the city of Scottsdale to provide water for something like 2 years until the community could figure out the next option. And they were discussing options with EPCOR and so on. And you're right. I don't like the idea of the state mandating, providing anything really. So that was one of them. But the other bill, I think, created a kind of a district, a standpipe water district, much like you'd have a fire district or something. And that was another solution that went forward. But it's a little off topic. You were asking about Kaiser's bills, but anyway.
It gets to local control, which is an important issue for us because we also argue for local control. As a state, we argue for local control from the feds. And then
I have said for years that I'm for local control, and I am. I generally vote that way, except if we're talking about a constitutional principle. The Constitution and its protections apply always and everywhere, and trump, as it were, the local control. So you have the right to free exercise of religion and to freedom of speech and the right to bear arms in Queen Creek because it's in both the federal and state constitution. So if a bill comes before me that says we're preempting the city or town on its local firearm regulation, then I'm going to vote for that. But if it's not a constitutional thing like that, then no, the city and towns definitely.
And then sort of going along those lines, we had issues of water transfers. So Queen Creek in particular made arrangements and had a bill passed so that we could purchase water rights from somebody with those rights on the Colorado. And there's still a lot of turmoil about that particular bill and people trying to undo it in some form or fashion. How do you see water transfers and in particular, what about groundwater and the talk about the Saudi farm?
We could spend a long time on that too.
Right.
But, You'd be glad to know that as far as the episodes higher into the curve, right? And Don and Gail Griffin, who have, to some extent, David Cook, who have much better grasp of the policy. Complex system. But in short, because we could spend all day, I'll make this as short as possible. In short, the water situation in Arizona arose from a policy that was called beneficial use. Whoever put the water first beneficial use was able to use it. So what that means for our purposes is that basically water in Arizona is a kind of ownership right. Basically, you have the right to use that water the same as to use your house. Basically, it's a very simplified version.
Sure.
And yes, there is the CAP, and yes, that's a public works project, and yes, to some extent, that's publicly financed. There is a tax associated with that, and an offset that goes to communities that don't use it and some things. But you still pay for the delivery of the water through the CAP, right? So it's still really, in a sense, kind of an ownership interest in a thing. So that's how it currently works, and I think how really it ought to continue unless you're doing a total overhaul of the system. Does that make sense?
It does. And so us being able to purchase rights from somebody who has those rights is perfectly fine.
Right.
And that brings us to one final major issue, the extension of Prop 400. So
Prop 400.
Prop 400 is the sales tax imposed by the voters of Maricopa County on themselves. It's run for, I believe, 20 years and then a subsequent 20 years. And now it's about to sunset. In order for Maricopa County voters to be able to vote on this tax, it has to be referred by the legislature. And so usually Maricopa Association of Governments, the 23 municipalities of the metro area, come up with a plan, present it, and it then gets referred. And then last year, Governor Ducey vetoed it and wrote an extensive letter about why he vetoed it. This year, we're having trouble getting it referred out. So where does it stand? Where do you stand? And what are the issues?
There are some proposals, I believe, still floating around. So there were at least two. I am not sure the exact status of them, but I'm glad that you mentioned 400. So Proposition 400 was first enacted in the first half of the 80s for 20 years, and then was re-upped in 2000s, and now it's up for renewal. And I hear a lot of things. Sometimes I hear some of the arguments down there that, well, Maricopa County is the only county that requires legislative approval, and that's not fair. But there's a reason for that. So, who here knows the population of Greenlee County, you know? Well, it's four figures. You know, there's only about 24,000 people in La Paz County, for example. La Paz County literally cannot tax itself to raise money for roads. It would be 100% tax, and it would still only raise a couple million, and they wouldn't be able to pay 100 miles desert highway. So La Paz County needs to come to the legislature to ask for appropriations of money for its transportation. So does Greenlee, Coconino, and all the others. Maricopa County, though, because it has 2 million people, can tax itself, half-cent sales tax, and pretty much provide for all of its own roads. And so the problem then becomes this. What incentive is there for a Maricopa County legislator to approve a transportation project in La Paz, or Greenlee, or Grant, or Gila, or any of them? I mean, there isn't really, because they have their own transportation infrastructure, can tax themselves, and why would they need to give money to the others? So to even the playing field, to see, because what really happens is politics, right? The person from La Paz knows he has to vote for the Coconino highway, so the guy in Coconino votes for the La Paz one. Yeah, you know, it's kind of how it works. So by involving the legislature, the Maricopa County folks know, you know, we have to support these greater Arizona projects, because we also need their support in passing our half-cent initiative. So that's the first thing that I want to point out, because often it's said it's unfair somehow, and I don't think it's unfair. I think that's why it's there. So it's up for renewal. And normally when you craft, certainly major legislation, you involve stakeholders, as they call them. And so if you involve stakeholders, let's pretend that we're going to come up with a law having to do with sex education in school. Let's just say. So the stakeholders might be certainly parents, maybe student teachers, probably county health, maybe groups that advocate for HIV, or it could be any number of stakeholders on that topic. But the problem there is that several of those people's interests will be aligned. County health department, state health department interests will be aligned. And anyway, it seems to me that the lion's share of input really should come from parents. So you can have a stakeholder meeting, but it doesn't really reflect what ought to come out there. And so with Prop 400, it's the same thing. The 2 million voters and their priorities should be what's reflected. And in the stakeholder meetings, too often we have these groups that go by the name MAG, like you said, but for our viewers, Maricopa Association of Governments meetings, what it is. I don't like acronyms, then people are too polite to ask what they are. The Maricopa Association of Governments is the government. And as a stakeholder, it amounts to the government lobbying for the government. There's a feedback loop there. I'm sure you can see the hazard here. If the coal miners and copper miners and cotton growers come to us, they represent those interests. But they're people in the economy, citizens, and when the government itself comes to you, its interests are in balancing its own budget, and that's a little bit dangerous. What we really need is to hear from the people who are going to pay the tax and what they want. So we have to be careful. Last year, there was a bond initiative. So all of what I just said is occurring against a greater backdrop. The greater backdrop is this. So that last year there was a bond initiative in Queen Creek, with Queen Creek Unified, which failed. There was also a half-cent sales tax on the ballot in Pinal County, which failed. And there was a sales tax on the ballot statewide for fire districts, which failed. And there was a ballot proposition that increased the voting threshold to approve new taxes, which succeeded. So tax increases on the local, the county, and the statewide level all failed last year. And indeed, they sent the message to the elected officials. The people sent us a message. The message was, you need to be better with what we're giving you. You need to manage more responsibly what we're already giving you. And we're not going to approve any of these tax increases. And I think that is the greater backdrop against which negotiations on Proposition 400 are ongoing.
So some of those issues, though, were conflated because the fire district, for example, had some fatal flaws, as well as the RTA for the Regional Transit Authority for Pinal County. But more importantly to what you just said was that, the voter should then have the ability to vote, and that's all that you're working on. So send the plan, and the governor signs it, and then Maricopa County voters vote on it across the board.
It was a plan sent under Ducey's veto. There are, I think, at least 2 versions of Prop 400 circulating right now. I presume that in the next week or 2 before we go home for the session, there will be further discussion on it. I'm not the lead man on that. I'm not the point man on that. For various reasons. For one, I don't live in Maricopa County. For another, I'm not the chairman of the Transportation Committee. And, I'm involved in other things. Like, as chairman of Ways and Means, we worked on eliminating the grocery tax and also on the rental tax and some other things. And I was involved in that. But the exact details of Prop 400, I at this moment, I don't really know. That's not true. I don't know the exact details, but I know that there are a couple of proposals still floating.
And the main thing is that we get something that Maricopa County can vote on. Because again, it's not asking the legislature to actually authorize the money. It's asking to allow the voters then to decide.
There's several things with Prop 400. One is the inclusion of money for light rail, which is a big political football. Maricopa Association of Governments rightly points out that if you do that, you can draw down some federal funds. Then the problem with federal funds is that you might have 10 congressmen in Los Angeles who are interested in pollution, so they want greater transportation options. You have 10 congressmen in New York City who have a subway system, and so they are prioritizing that. But, those 20 congressmen and their concerns for transportation don't mirror what we need in Queen Creek. I mean, a bus lane might be better in Queen Creek, for example, or just might be more efficient and cost effective and move people more rapidly than a rail option, and that's something that's debatable, certainly. But so you have to be careful. I understand their position, and this is why I say really it should come from the people and not from the government and their priorities that may or may not align. Also, keep in mind that the original iteration of Prop 400 in the 80s was to build freeways, and it did build freeways. It occurs to some members of the legislature that what's going on now is a cost shifting by cities, towns, counties, and so on, of their normal road upkeep or arterial construction onto Prop 400 funds, which frees up funds then for other projects. And then some of that isn't going to freeways, which is what it was supposed to go to. So a lot of the discussion revolves around what percentage goes to freeways versus other things, particularly light rail. And a lot of it revolves around other stuff like, is it up to the legislature to draft the ballot description and other sort of political realities?
Right, because ultimately, anything you're doing there is just to get it to the voters to vote on.
Right.
And so ultimately, it does come back to the voters and is up to the voters of Maricopa County to tax themselves. But without that coming out, already projects are being sunsetted, which means if they don't have their 5-year funding cycle, then they're taken and put on the shelf. And that's where we get into the cost overruns automatically, because concrete, everything else is just going through the roof. So we got to get it done sooner rather than later, or it ends up costing more money
That's
than.
a big problem with school construction too. I think we're aware of that.
Very good. Good. At this point, we could take some questions from the audience.
I have a question. So you talked about the increase in education, but the reduction of the in-classroom. So with that increase, were there any limitations set as far as what percentage it needed to be spent in classroom?
No, so maybe I mischaracterized this. The state legislature increased funding to education, period, by law. And the local school districts chose to spend some of that not on teachers in classroom projects. You'd have to ask that. We block fund as a legislature the districts, and then they spend the money. In fact, it's an important constitutional thing, separation of powers thing.
So there weren't any regulations as far as how much needed to be spent appropriately to different divisions within their local school district?
The school funding is pretty complicated. There's a formula that goes to the districts for how many students there are. There's also a school transportation formula. There is a facilities board that, like you pointed out, is supposed to be constructing schools. There are different things going on, but my point is that school funding is at an all-time high. It's the highest that's ever been in state history. It's higher than the voter-imposed constitutional cap. It's more than half of the state budget. We're still giving it 6.9% more. And while we're doing that, we're seeing school districts choose to spend less of the money they're getting in the classroom. The reason I make that point is because that suggests to me that education is fully funded.
Absolutely. No, exactly. Legislative being very generous. So that's why I was just wondering if there's any stipulations in getting that money.
It's a good article
Where it
to read.
needs to be appropriated.
March 2nd, you can write down March 2nd, the Arizona Capital Times, you can see the article. Now, to be fair, since we're in Queen Creek, I have a good relationship with the superintendents in our district. I live in the Florence Unified School District, and I attended their district meeting this week. I also attended their district meeting last month. I've attended the Higley one this year. I've attended the Queen Creek one. And I speak with Chris Knudsen and Perry Berry, the Queen Creek superintendent, regularly. He's been to my office and been here. And I asked him about that. And he said, it's not the case in Queen Creek. So in Queen Creek, in-classroom spending did increase, to be fair. But statewide, it didn't. And of course, we're budgeting statewide. And it's just an interesting fact. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are certain narratives that circulate in the media. And some of those narratives are not totally correct.